Yo, what's up, guys? It's Luca Kassab. Welcome back to Kassab's Corner. This weekend was the Austrian Grand Prix for Formula One. It was a sprint race weekend, so we had qualifying on Friday, a sprint qualifying and sprint race on Saturday, and the actual race on Sunday. So we got a lot of action this weekend. Max Verstappen, as usual, won the race, won the sprint, won qualifying. Started on pole for both the sprint and in the actual race. Another dominant weekend by Max Verstappen. A lot of people don't like this for the sport, but me as a Max Verstappen fan, I love it. Max, 71 laps today, was in the lead for 69 of them, and he was just flat out dominant all weekend. In the wet on Saturday, in the action-packed sprint race, Max was phenomenal. Outside of that first turn and a little bit wacky of a start, Max was dominant. No one was challenging him, and not even his own teammate. He was so far ahead of P2 and Perez. It's crazy. So Max P1, perfect weekend for him. Even was able to pit for fastest lap at the very end of the race. Okay, Charles Leclerc was second. For Ferrari, they needed this result, especially for Charles. He's had a really unlucky season. And to be on the podium once again, it was big for Charles and his confidence. And he had a pretty good weekend. While him and Sainz were close all weekend in the race, they were about the same. But Friday, Charles pulls out a crazy lap in qualifying to get within a tenth of Max Verstappen. It's like 0.048 behind. It's a crazy lap. While the sprint race and sprint qualifying were not great for Charles, they were good enough, and he still scored in them. Okay, third place, Checo Perez. Again, Checo. Friday was another disaster. Missed Q3 for the fourth consecutive race. And overall, he shouldn't be in the position here where every race it feels like he's having a driver of the day type race because he's going from, I don't know, like today, 15th to 3rd. But it shouldn't be like that every weekend. Shouldn't be. Checo had a good race, but today P2 was so possible. Carlos Sainz held him up. He was gaining on Leclerc. He was going to catch him, but he just couldn't stick a move into turn 3. Couldn't stick it. He'd get by, but then would not have the DRS. Opposite to what Max did. Max would always be behind the DRS and take the lead after that. He just wasn't able to make that move, and not being able to make a move stick right away is what sold him P2 today. It should have been a Red Bull 1-2 in terms of pace. Fourth, my guy, Lando. And that's a huge result for McLaren. McLaren, they haven't had a single race this year in the top 5. But today, fourth place for Lando. And he just showed the talent he has, but also what the upgrades could do for both him and Oscar Piastri. Piastri's not Lando's level of driver, but he still is a good race car driver. So Lando P4 was huge. Got a little lucky by the penalties that came with track limits, but beating out everyone except one Ferrari and 2 Red Bulls, it's a pretty good result. Lando loves Austria, and it's pretty clear. Amazing qualifying. Sprint race, it looked like he had a chance at the lead in the sprint race when Max and Checo started fighting. But again, wasn't lucky. Missed the sprint race points. But Lando, phenomenal weekend. Loves Austria. Let's see what McLaren can do. Both McLarens when they're upgraded in Silverstone. Fernando Alonso, 5th. And the whole Aston Martin protest thing was hilarious. But Fernando Alonso, 5th place. It wasn't a great weekend for him based on the expectations we have. But this seems like a place where Aston is. I don't think Aston's a top 3 car anymore. I think that them and Mercedes are close, but I think Ferrari's faster, and Red Bull's definitely been faster. Fernando Alonso with 5th, I wouldn't complain if I were him. It's a spot you wanted. And again, the fact that Carlos got 10 seconds worth of penalties helped him. Right into it. Carlos was 6th. He had a phenomenal weekend for Ferrari. All weekend, he was more comfortable in that car. Carlos' 6th place is really disappointing. Ferrari's strategy at the beginning wasn't great, double stacking the cars, but wasn't a terrible thing, and he finished P4. He had a chance at the podium, and that the 10 seconds worth of penalties based on Aston's appeal. It's whatever. But that's what cost him that P4. Overall, Carlos had as good of a weekend as Charles. He looked more confident in qualifying. In the sprint shootout, P3, and he was the confident Ferrari. He was the Ferrari that was able to drive in the wet. And on Friday, he was faster than Charles the whole time until that very last super lap by Charles. Both Mercedes 7 and 8, George 7, Lewis 8. Both of them, as Lewis said, the car was undrivable. The two of them could have had better weekends. Mercedes could have had a better weekend. But it's whatever. At this point, they're faster than Aston, in my opinion. But I don't think they have a driver on the same level as Fernando Alonso. George, starting 15th in quali today, starting and missing Q3 in quali, and then now George being up to 7th, it's a result he'll take. And yesterday in the sprint, he did a good job being able to pit early because he wasn't in a great position beforehand, but the ability he had to pit early, get on the slicks, and then score himself some points in the sprint, that was huge for him. Lewis, just a terrible weekend. Lando was faster than him, and then he got another set of penalties because he crossed the white line, safety car track infringement. Lewis 8th, not what he wanted, and the fact Toto had to calm him down was not great, but whatever. Lewis, also not a great sprint, just not a good overall weekend for Mercedes, but especially for Lewis Hamilton. 9th, Lance Stroll. The 3-stop worked, I guess. Lance actually had a very impressive weekend, in my opinion. In quali, he was about the same pace as Fernando. He out-qualified Fernando. That was the big thing. Then in the sprint, he did enough. He scored points and he beat Fernando once again. Okay? Lance Stroll, good quali, good sprint race. Actual race was a little sketchy because, again, double stack. Not a great start. But Lance pulled off a 3-stop, got 9th place, and was able to not get any track infringements. I'd say that's a good result for Lance, though in that Aston, he could be doing more. 10th final point place, Pierre Gasly. Gasly had kind of a weird weekend because quali, it didn't feel great. Quali was not quali. Sprint quali was not great, and the sprint race wasn't great for him. But in the actual quali and the actual race, Pierre had a good weekend. 10th place, that's a point, and he finished 9th. It's just the fact he got penalties afterwards. He did enough, and the fact he got a point is what's big for Pierre Gasly. 11th, we had Alex Albon. Sprint, it looked, first, qualifying was impressive. And in the sprint qualifying, also pulling that car into Q3 was impressive. But Alex Albon, he was 11th today, and in the sprint quali especially. Williams missed out on some points. Because that Williams in a straight line is extremely hard to pass. And they had that going for them in the sprint. He was running in 6th, and then they decided to pit him. I think if they didn't pit him, he would have gotten a point in the sprint. So I didn't agree with the decision by Williams, but again, they're professionals, and Alex did all he could this weekend. Zhou was 12th. Zhou had a quiet race, but Zhou had a quietly good race, I'd say. While he wasn't in the points, he's not shown really on TV, but he does enough. He does what he has to. And while it's not points, he overtakes other drivers. And the best part is, in a car of that caliber, not getting any infringements is really impressive. Sargent was 13th. Overall, his best weekend in Formula 1 and for Williams. The infringements, they hurt him a little bit. That was like 15 seconds worth of penalties. But his teammate had the same thing. And Sargent just, he did what he had to, it felt like, this weekend. And I wouldn't say he had a great weekend, but getting out of Q1 no, he didn't get out of Q1 in either. But in this, being able to get 13th and just, he was in the points at one point. This was his best weekend in Formula 1. It wasn't chaotic, and he was just driving. That's what it felt like. Ocon 14th. 30 seconds worth of penalties. Disaster weekend for him. Unsafe release wasn't his fault. It's just time to let go of that. Come on to the next, because he's been a good driver this year. He's gotten the results he's needed. Bottas was 15th. This dude, he's not a great Formula 1 driver anymore. I get the Alfa Romeo's not a great car, but he's fighting for 15th. He got a little unlucky with the Yuki incident at the beginning. But again, that is how the sport works. You got to recover. And he lacked pace. He wasn't on an ideal strategy, but he still lacked pace. 16th Piastri. Again, the McLaren without the upgrades. It's going to be really interesting to see how the upgrades go for him and what role they could play. But a disappointing weekend for him regardless. Out in Q1 on Friday. And then today, he got stuck behind Stroll, Tsunoda, and Magnussen when they were fighting. And his rear wing, he went right into the back of Kevin Magnussen with his wing. And that was practically the end of it. He was running in the low places the entire race. Hopefully Silverstone's better for him, because we've seen he can fight for points. And the upgrades on the McLaren look like they're going to be good. So that's going to be big for Piastri, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens for him and how much better he drives with the upgrades. 17th, Nick De Vries. He did beat Tsunoda this weekend. But again, 15 seconds worth of penalties. Forced Magnussen off the track. This dude's not a Formula 1 level driver. I'm rooting for him. I want to see him succeed. But out of Q1 on Friday, that was good for him. But then in the sprint, didn't do much. And then today, it seemed he pushed Magnussen off. And it was every time they were looking at him, he was doing something wrong. Say infringements, forcing another driver wide, getting past. He's not a Formula 1 level talent yet. And I don't think he will be. So De Vries is a guy who I say you got to let go of. Drop him at the mid-season point, throw Liam Lawson in the car, and see what he can do. I get the AlphaTauri's not great, but to be this far off of your teammate all the time, and this being a weekend you beat him, with everything that happened, it shows he's not a Formula 1 talent. Yes, he was great for Williams last year, but you got to think how much of that was based on the straight line speed we've seen last year and this year in the Williams. Nick De Vries, I hope that he turns up, but he's not a Formula 1 level driver right now. 18th K-Mag got owned by Hülkenberg all weekend. Magnussen, not a great weekend. The Haas just wasn't good once you put the tires into use. The tires were great at the beginning of their stints in the warm-ups, but after that, the Haas just wasn't great. And it showed with both Magnussen and Hülkenberg, who we'll talk about later. Magnussen, not a great race. Getting forced off, an infringement. Better weekends ahead for him at Haas. And 19th of the 19 runners who finished, Yuki Tsunoda. Again, that first lap was not great. Being beaten by De Vries was not great. The qualifying wasn't great for him. But the big thing with Yuki was the fact that first lap, he did too much. That was a nice little inside dive, which he did on the first lap. But then he got forced. That wasn't his fault, but he was in a bad position there and couldn't do anything to get out of the incident. But then almost going into the back of Albon, when you know you're already missing part of your front wing, it's just inexperience, and that's not a good decision. I would have wished that Tsunoda took that more carefully and that he actually realized the damage that was on his wing, because the infringements alone were big for him. But that first lap is what ruined his entire race. Again, not a guy who I see, while he's been great, not a guy I see moving up to a Red Bull team from the sister team. Finally, Hülkenberg. Hülkenberg had a great weekend until the race today. It was partially due to the Haas being so great on the tires, but qualifying, he put himself on the second row, and then yesterday in the sprint got himself some points, but he was in the podium. He was second place at the end of the first lap. The soft was good, being able to get onto the softs off the slicks and get into the points. Hülkenberg had a great sprint race. He had a great qualifying, and he overachieved with the car. In the tire warm-up, he did well with that. It's just unlucky in the race that his engine died. Now, on the note of all these infringements, I had a problem this weekend with the track limits. The whole thing is, I understand the white line is the rule, but if every driver is making that mistake in qualifying, in the race, something's up with that. And if you really want to eliminate that, you got to put a gravel trap in between turn 9 and turn 10. Because that's where everyone's going wide. No one's going to go for that extra pace if there's a gravel trap there.